Hi, my name is Megan Vahsen, and I'm really excited to present to you today our work on forecasting in coastal wetlands. I want to thank the organizers of this session, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the rest of the talks. It's really well recognized that our coastal systems are highly vulnerable in the context of global change. At a very basic level, sea level rise threatens their function as natural barriers between the ocean and communities of organisms, including humans, on land. Coastal wetlands contribute considerably to the carbon budget by storing carbon in their saturated soils. And much like on land, plants mediate ecosystem dynamics in coastal wetlands. I find that this figure from Matt Kerwin and Pat McGonigal does a really beautiful job of representing how plants mediate the process of accretion, which is basically just the change in elevation of a marsh surface relative to sea level through time. Above ground, plants help slow tidal flows, increasing the amount of sediment that falls onto the marsh surface. And below ground, carbon addition from plant roots and rhizomes after a growing season induces what's called subsurface expansion, which increases marsh elevation below ground. We can see that sea level also mediates these two forms of accretion, and this relationship can be explained by a simple parabolic function, such that at intermediate level of flooding, there is the best growth or maximum biomass. This biophysical feedback between plant biomass, flooding, and elevation is actually what has allowed marshes and coastal wetlands to keep pace with historic sea level rise for millennia. So not only are plants in coastal marshes sensitive to flooding and sea level rise, but their growth is also influenced by other climate change drivers, such as elevated CO2, salinity, and the presence of interspecific competitors. And this has really been long understood in the coastal marsh research community. In fact, our collaborators at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Edgewater, Maryland in the Chesapeake Bay have been continuously running an elevated CO2 experiment since the 1980s. Beyond the Chesapeake Bay, there's also an abundance of data that can be used to characterize plant growth, carbon storage, and marsh accretion globally. Recently, the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network, which I'm a part of, put together this database in a Shiny app to curate and share coastal carbon-related data. This work can be accredited to the efforts of Jim Holmquist, Michael Loneman, and Dave Klingus, and I really recommend you check it out. More than data, there's also many numerical models that can be used to characterize this ecological process of marsh accretion. One of the most prominent is the marsh equilibrium model by Jim Morris at the University of South Carolina, which you can see the web interface down at the bottom here. So given the high priority of coastal systems, the abundance of data, and the well-established models describing this biophysical relationship, there's a really good opportunity for ecological forecasting. And what I mean by this is going beyond just a point prediction of marsh elevation through time, which you can see here. What we really might want is uncertainty in that prediction, so that we can provide a prediction much like as sea level rise or global climate change, a point prediction with some confidence bounds, with the ultimate goal of improving the forecast through time as we learn more about the system and decreasing that uncertainty. But before we can get to decreasing uncertainty, we really need to understand where that uncertainty in our forecast is coming from, which is one of the goals of the presentation today. Our initial effort to forecast marsh elevation that I'm presenting today will focus on 4 sources of uncertainty and use a first principles framework that's from Mike Dietz's Ecological Forecasting book. First, we can think about what's called parameter uncertainty, or in our case, how confident we are in the values of our parameters in that quadratic regression that relates flooding and biomass. Parameter uncertainty decreases as we continue to sample because we get a better idea of what our mean value of that parameter looks like with increased number of data points. We also characterized in our forecast today process variance, which basically explains how well our model represents a true ecological process. Again, we're using the Marsh equilibrium model, and one of the hallmarks of that model is this characterization of the parabolic relationship. To characterize these two sources of uncertainty, we use data from an mesocosm experiment that we conducted last summer out at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. On the right here, you can see why these experiments are called Marsh organ experiments. We have these PVC pipes that are stacked like a church organ, and because they're in a tidal creek, having these PVC pots at different elevation allows plants to be in different flooding regimes across the growing season. Our third source of uncertainty that we characterize in our forecasting is driver uncertainty, which in our case is characterizing the uncertainty in sea level rise. We use data from the USGS of projections of a median and range sea level rise through time, and we constructed a confidence interval around that and parameterized our driver through time. And then finally, we characterize initial condition uncertainty, which in our case is the initial elevation of the Marsh surface. We used what we know about real-time kinematic GPS, which is also known as RTK GPS, which characterizes the elevation of a surface like the Marsh surface. It's quite precise and can get within a couple centimeters precision. So to overview our methodology, we fit a Bayesian quadratic regression to our experimental data to characterize both parameter uncertainty and process variance. We define driver uncertainty using sea level rise projections and use our information of what we know about RTK GPS to inform initial condition uncertainty. We use Monte Carlo sampling to propagate uncertainty through our forecast through the Marsh equilibrium model. And then finally, we sought to understand exactly where our uncertainty and our predictions of Marsh elevation is coming from. And the way we did that, we can simply describe as looking at different types of simulations. For example, we calculated the variance of our predicted elevation at each time point. For different types of simulations, like on the left, we allowed all sources of uncertainty to be included, versus on the right, we turned off the uncertainty in sea level rise, for example. What's important to note here is that sea level rise is still included in the model, but there's no variance around what we project sea level rise to be. It's just a single line through time. By comparing these two variances, we can see how much uncertainty in sea level rise influence the uncertainty in our predictions of Marsh elevation through time. We're still getting started with this, so I'm going to show you a couple examples of what this forecasting framework might look like based on data from that summer 2019 experiment. So in this first case, we're using one genotype from this experiment. This was a genotype by environment experiment. So we have few data points across to characterize this parabolic curve. Using those four types of uncertainty that I talked about, we then created a forecast for different states in our model. From top to bottom, left to right, we have predicted biomass, flooding depth, marsh elevation, the organic accretion rate, and the sediment accretion rate, which, to remind you, the sediment accretion rate is what's going on above ground, sediment falling out of the water column, and the organic accretion rate is what's going on below ground, the root and rhizomes contributing to elevation gain. In the Chesapeake Bay, organic accretion is the main contributor to total accretion. Based on these forecasts of marsh elevation, we then decomposed where that uncertainty was coming from. And you can see here on the left is the proportion of that uncertainty split between those four different sources across time, and on the right is averaged across the 50-year projection. In the first couple of decades, we can see that initial condition uncertainty really dominates where the variance in elevation is coming from. But as we continue on through time, driver uncertainty and parameter uncertainty become important. And this makes sense because we become less confident in what we think sea level will be into the future, and we only have few data points to characterize that relationship, so our parameter uncertainty would be high. Now we can look and see what would happen if we used all of the data in this particular experiment. In this case, we can see that that confidence band on the left around the parabola is quite skinny, which is represented by having a lot of data. Again, having a lot of data means that we have really high confidence in what the mean of our parameter might be. On the right, we see wider confidence intervals, particularly for biomass and organic accretion rate. This again makes sense because we have quite noisier data, although we have a lot more of it. If we then move to partition that variance, we also see this reflected in our graphs here. Again, initial condition uncertainty is quite important. However, parameter uncertainty decreases and process error increases as compared to our last run with a subset of data. This makes sense because we have a lot more data, but they're a lot noisier, so our process variance increases. With this framework, we're excited to keep moving forward. So the first thing we're going to do is include random effects to further partition out residual or process variance. So in our case, we had a bunch of different genotypes in this experiment, and we want to account for that variability. Moving beyond the experiment, we look to continue to add more data to our calibration, including field observation of biomass and remotely sensed data. As you can see here on the right, field biomass can be quite noisy, but actually follows the shape of that curve quite well. In our exercise here, we focused on that parabolic relationship and left a lot of parameters static. So we want to use data to inform uncertainties and other parameters in the Marsh equilibrium model, leaning on work done by the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network to kind of characterize those parameters. And then finally, we hope to assimilate data through time in a state space framework to help constrain uncertainties in our forecast. So on the right here, you can see an example of a particle filter using simulated data, where our filtered trajectory of on the graph represents a weighted average between data observed through time and what our forecast would be at each step through time. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people that helped with this project, including collaborators at Notre Dame, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, University of Tennessee, and Boston University. And I'd like to thank my funding sources from the U.S. Coastal Research Program, where we're going to be doing fieldwork next summer that had to be postponed, but we'll get at characterizing observation variance and estimates of biomass to help inform this project. And then finally, our Blue Jeans NSF-funded project, which focuses a lot on the genotype by environment experiments that I was mentioning before. Thanks for your time.